great host, Tom Donnelly here, was gracious enough to extend an invitation for us to open the Army Strategy Conference, the 27th Annual Army War College Strategy Conference here at the American Enterprise Institute. The conference's theme this year is Defense Choices for the Next Administration, and it's really sort of a broad envelope, a broad umbrella of subjects we'll be talking about over the next 4 days, or 2 days, excuse me. For 3 years running, the War College has actually partnered with a number of thought leaders, think tanks, and government agencies in the DC area to actually sort of sharpen the debate and the discussions that go on at the Army War College's Strategy Conference. This year's no different. In fact, this year what we decided to do, over previous years what we've done is actually had the conference still in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and brought all those great thought leaders up to Pennsylvania to have this discussion. This year what we've done is taken a much more distributed approach to the conference and brought the discussion down here. There are going to be some plenary events. In fact, the War College has already hosted one major speaker at the War College this morning prior to this event. There will be some additional plenary events up at the War College, but by and large, the conversation is going to largely occur down here and through virtual participation up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Our folks will be able to join in. We're grateful this year to be joined in the conference by 4 key partners. The American Enterprise Institute, as I already talked about in my opening, is our first conference, our first panel, and then followed by the Center for New American Security this afternoon, the Center for Strategic and International Studies tomorrow morning, and the Atlantic Council tomorrow afternoon. So we look forward to actually a pretty broad and expansive discussion on a number of topics. Over the next 2 days, these world-class institutions in partnership with the Army War College will offer 4 important panel discussions that range from this morning's discussion on sort of this key defense choices for the upcoming administration to kick it off, followed by a panel on Army readiness this afternoon, a panel on 21st century deterrence at CSIS tomorrow morning, and then wrapped up in the end with a panel on the future of U.S. alliances at the Atlantic Council, or with the Atlantic Council, actually will occur at CSIS. This morning's panel is intended to explore defense strategy development from various vectors. Ideally, defense strategy and defense choices would emerge from 3 common understandings. First, a common understanding of the military challenges and demands that face the United States. Second, a common view on the best way to meet those demands with military capabilities. And finally, third, a common view of the allocation of priorities and resources to actually go forward and meet those demands. The reality is fundamentally different, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Since the end of the Cold War, but more importantly, over the last 15 years, the threat horizon has expanded. So much so that a common perspective on the most important threats and the demands associated with those threats is elusive at best. A common view on how best to meet an increasingly atomized threat universe is virtually impossible as well, given the wide diversity of perspectives on prioritization. And finally, allocation of resources is perhaps the most challenging because of its unavoidable intersection with the preferences of a number of important domestic constituencies. In short, the defense strategy is a product of 5 interdependent relationships. First, there are real threats and challenges in the international security environment, and they have an intersection with U.S. interests. Second, there's a domestic political environment that we have to consider, competing domestic perceptions of hazard, and of course the attendant appetite and competing views of the appetite for the United States to invest in defense capabilities and actually employ those capabilities in some form of military activism. Third, there are the preferences of the defense industrial base and the defense interested industries. Fourth, there are competing defense and military stakeholders, right? Some are watching in the Pentagon right now. There's the services, the combatant commands, the higher level staffs and defense agencies. And then finally, there's the actual policy and strategy development process and those who control it in the Pentagon. These 5 forces interact with one another and compete with one another for primacy in the process. The next president and the national security team that he or she chooses, will face a daunting set of defense choices. Today's discussion will delve into the real sausage making that are involved in making these choices and developing a coherent defense design from them. Joining me on the stage are longtime professional colleagues of mine. Very happy to be here with them. First, representing our host, the American Enterprise Institute, is Mr. Tom Donnelly. Tom is a defense and security policy analyst at AEI, and he is the co-director of AEI's Marilyn Ware Center for Security Studies. Tom was also a longtime staffer on Capitol Hill, as I recall.
That's correct.
He was the policy group director and a professional staff member for the House Armed Services Committee. Next to Tom is Sean Brimley, another long friend of mine. Sean is a recent veteran of the Obama administration's national security staff, as well as the Pentagon, and currently serves as the executive vice president and director of studies at the Center for New American Security. It's a great pleasure to have both of you here. What I want to do just before I yield the chair is there are a couple admin notes. First and foremost, we're going to give the guests here about 5 to 7 minutes to kind of make setup remarks, to set up a discussion, and then I'll probably cue them with a few questions before we set into a Q&A from the audience. And I also would like to invite those who are participating in the World Wide Web out there to use the hashtag AWCStratConf and AWC StratConf, AWCSTRAT Conf, C-O-N-F, or hashtag StratConf to actually forward questions to us through Twitter, and we'd be happy to field those questions as they come along. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Nate. And as the representative of the hosting institution, I'd like to say thanks to the War College for including us in what I think is a pretty adventurous and innovative way to maybe add some new dimensions to institution. The strategy conference has been going on for 3 decades. It really is a centerpiece of the Army War College year. So it's a great honor to participate in it, and I guess I'll say hey to everybody out there in Carlisle land while I'm at it. But we're really pleased to be partnering with you guys on this. This is something we'd like to continue in the future, and thanks to you for your direction and energy in making it happen. But to turn to the subject that we wanted to talk about today, which is more sort of how does the strategy and force planning process work in reality, since it's not really driven by formal doctrine or anything like that. I would say I would like to add one thing to the mix that you threw in, and that is going back to the really first root question: what do we Americans want the world to look like? What would victory look like for us? And that's kind of, I think, where we've gone astray really since the end of the Cold War. The Cold War looks in retrospect, or the force planning during the Cold War, was very much threat-driven. The Soviets would do something, and then we would respond to it, or we would try to invent something that would give us a leg up on what was a pretty well-defined competition. Man-portable guided anti-tank missiles, the competition, the undersea competition, who had the fastest fighter with the biggest radar, and so on and so forth. But really what underlay the Cold War competition was a pretty abiding sense of what our strategic interests were. Obviously, protecting ourselves here at home, and then the balance of power across Eurasia. Obviously, the Soviet Union was primarily a European power, but there were also East Asian dimensions to it, and as the Soviets tried to gain influence and proxies in what used to be called the Third World, the competition spread more globally. So I think it would behoove us, and one thing I'd really like Sean to address, because both of us have worked on a number of these bipartisan review panels set by the Congress to give a scorecard on things like the Quadrennial Defense Review. I think at least my experience was, having done a couple of these things, is that all the experts and the leaders of those panels really found themselves going back to these first order questions and having to deduce from the way Americans have actually operated and behaved in the world what the principles were, because there's not really a concise statement of what our national interests are, per se, or our national security interests. So I would say that has introduced an element of confusion that's spread across the sort of subsidiary or follow-on categories that you described. If you don't know what you're interested in, then it's hard to decide which threats are the ones you should really pay attention to. If you can't decide who the bad guys are, then it's hard to figure out how to deal with them, and so on and so forth down the line. And also, it's very difficult to communicate in a broad way to achieve a domestic political consensus that this is sort of the right way to go, or even have the kind of debates that we had during the Cold War about whether, whether we should, say, defend Greece early in the Cold War. So I think I'll stop there in my opening remarks, but we've seen all kinds of approaches to defense planning, and it's really remarkable to see how none of them has really survived more than a couple of years. The reason that we keep having to do it over and over again is that we don't seem to be able to get it right, and I think really the problem is we're not asking the right questions.
Right. Sean?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me. Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Tom, for hosting. I've known Nate for, I don't know, more than 10 years. Tom and I worked briefly when you had your little sojourn at CSIS about 10 years ago. So
I recovered quickly.
thanks for joining me. Nate asked a series of broad questions, so I'll give sort of my take on, and you'll see where my mind is at these days. I'm engaging a fair bit with friends in the House and Senate as they do their markups soon, and also this big debate about Goldwater-Nichols and defense reform that I think the Senate is posed to take up. So I've been thinking a lot lately about the original Goldwater-Nichols Act, the Nunn-Cohen Amendment. I think in '86 it created a Special Operations Command, and the role of Congress in shaping, and those were pretty big moves when you think about it. And I think we're poised to sort of see perhaps similar sorts of moves in the coming year or two. So it's an interesting time to be a defense analyst. But let me just give some overarching comments, maybe some that I can sort of tee off, Tom, and we can have a little bit back and forth. First of all, on the security environment, I grow a little bit tired sometimes when I see a lot of the same talking points. The world has never been more complex. It's never been more challenging since, the founding of the Republic. That's hooey, right? The world is not more complex, I think, than it was during the Cold War. Yes, it's true that we don't have a singular overarching threat in the Soviet Union, but I think that overstates the case. I mean, when you read a lot of the contemporary documents from the Cold War, it wasn't as if they had this overarching, unified, grand design. There were huge debates going on, profound disagreements about national interests. When you look at the wars we fought during the Cold War, the hot wars in sort of Vietnam or the Korean Peninsula, not the battlefields of Europe, all of the sort of so it's quote unquote lesser included conflicts that we got into. I mean, that was an incredibly complex time. The use of nuclear weapons, the rise of precision munitions, huge sort of epoch-changing ways, warfighting systems that we're still grappling with to this day, and I'll get to that in a second. So I tend to think that we have experienced huge, complex system ordering challenges before, and frankly, we've done pretty well. And so I'm a sort of I think a more confident position. I don't look at the world and grow overly alarmed that things are, that the cards are stacked against us. I'm not shocked that Russia is, asserting itself in its near abroad in Ukraine. I mean, the whole, 1,000-year history, leads me to not be surprised that Russia is acting the way it is. I'm not surprised by instability in the Middle East, right? Newsflash, the Middle East is a complex, frustrating place. So I don't see the rise of, say, and there's lots of tactical and operational critiques that we can get into about what the Obama administration did or the Bush administration did, but these are sort of tactics. But the broader idea that the Middle East is in the area of concern doesn't surprise me. I do think the main challenge as we look in the operational environment is, I think, the rise of China and what that portends for the rise of what I would say is a near-peer competitor inside of the next 5, 10, 15 years. I think that's real, and I'll talk to that in a little bit. But I think the core operational challenge, speaking to our friends in Carlisle, is, from my view, is adapting the joint force to a world where precision munitions are going to be more ubiquitous in all operating domains. There's been a whole bunch of talk about the third offset strategy, what that means, and I think the department's done a pretty generally poor job of articulating exactly what they're trying to do. But to me, when I look at the FY17 budget, we can get into this, it's really all about trying to adapt the joint force to this precision munition,
Proliferation.
yes, an operating environment that's defined by the proliferation of precision munitions across all operating domains, whether it's Hezbollah using anti-ship missiles, as they did about 10 years ago, or whether it's what Russia is doing in the Ukraine, sort of marrying drones and artillery and increasingly sophisticated technology, and certainly what's happening in the Asia Pacific. So I think that's the key operational challenge, and I think what Secretary Carter and Bob Work have been doing when you discern all of their speeches, and thankfully now we have real dollars and priorities in the FY17 budget that says to me that we're starting to see this, starting to see moves being made. And I think that has a lot of impact when we think about operational concepts, has a lot of impact when we think about warfighting doctrine, that has a lot of impact for when we think about what the Hill may be doing in terms of overall defense reform. So the question of defense strategy, it's a fraught and a frustrating exercise, and let me just end with a few minor points. You have a bunch of players in this system, and each of them have their own unique challenges. In my view, the White House tends to be consumed by the inbox. Everything is a crisis. The number of deputies committee meetings and principals committee meetings happening on what is our long-range strategy for the Asia Pacific? How do we think about how to evolve our armed forces and roles and missions, sort of Key West type of debates? That doesn't happen there. That's all about where the president is going, for his Asia trip, what he needs to do in terms of deliverables, and how to respond to all the key crises that are perceived in the international environment. The COCOMs is interesting. So 30 years after Goldwater-Nichols, we have these massive entities, Central Command, European Command, Pacific Command, all headed by 4 stars. Most of the subordinate commands are headed by 4 stars. I think this is a point of interest among folks on the Hill looking at it. The proliferation of general officer ranks, it's just between 9/11 and now. Secretary Gates went after this in his efficiencies task force a few years ago, and I think we're going to have another round of this. But, these COCOMs are massive, and they were designed to focus on warfighting. But what happens when we actually go to war? These combatant commands, they create joint task forces that actually focus on the warfight. These combatant commands, they're massive, and they do a lot of mill-mill relationships, a lot of what I would call defense diplomacy, a lot of presence, a lot of engagement. It's all to the good, but it's not really what they were built originally to do. And I think that's an interesting point to think of. The problem is, if you're a COCOM commander, you're charged with everything in your region. Therefore, everything in your region is a priority, and therefore you ask for a lot. You ask for a lot of operational forces. You ask for a lot of presence forces. You ask for a lot of other kinds of resources. In my experience, the Joint Staff tends to view COCOM requests as requirements, and all of these requirements get dumped into some sort of what I call the gonculator, what I think is a pretty fraught exercise in the Pentagon to try to prioritize all of these different COCOM quote-unquote requirements, and that just tends to produce this huge appetite for more, and more. The services, in my view, tend to be institutionally detached from the warfighting perspective. And I think this is another maybe second, third order effect of the Goldwater-Nichols legislation. So you create these big COCOMs that are focused on the warfight, and the services now are focused on the organized, train, and equip, which is fine, but as Secretary Gates has detailed in his memoirs, that has produced sort of a Pentagon that tends to be focused on, other things other than the current warfight. And so they're concerned. The services tend to be concerned about the quantity of their end strength and the quality of their capabilities and the overall mix of their force structure. The Secretary of Defense, as an institutional position, tends to be consumed with the representational requirements for all the overseas travel, representational requirements for the Situation Room, and to sort of be that presence there. And also, he or she is the chief advocate for the DoD budget on Capitol Hill. And the lawmakers, finally on lawmakers, they increasingly, I think, don't see the DoD budget as a distinct and important component of discretionary spending in and of itself. But I would say, maybe in an argumentative way, as a core wedge issue to be used in the context of overall debates about defense, about overall discretionary spending. Mm-hmm. And I think this is how we ended up with sequestration several years ago. So DoD was kind of lumped in there as a bargaining chip as we think about overall defense spending. And that's not wrong, but it's problematic, I think, if you're thinking about trying to set long-term, relatively long-term, steady budget horizon for DoD. So this is all to say that defense strategy is badly needed, and we need to make hard choices. And I think civilian leaders have sort of lost the charge somewhere along the line of assuming risk on behalf of the department. So you'll often hear debates about force development and overall spending couched in terms of, well, this presents too great of a risk, right? The Army tends to do this a lot. We are not sized and structured properly, and therefore that represents, unacceptable risk. Well, it's the Secretary of Defense's job and civilian policymakers' job to assume that risk, mm-hmm. which is to say, you can't have everything. And here are you can't have everything. What are the things you need the most? Okay? And if you think that presents certain levels of risk, okay, we'll take that risk on behalf of the citizens. And if that goes wrong, and these say we decide to have a more expeditionary army, for instance, and we have to take risk on overall end strength, we get the mix of the active and National Guard a little bit off. That risk, that policy risk is borne by civilian leaders. And I think that part of the conversation tends to get lost. Strategy is about risk. There's nothing about strategy that doesn't accept risk, because otherwise you're just throwing money at the problem. Finally, I would say from the defense perspective, I think DoD has tended to assume more that they do too much. Bob Works talked a little bit about this early in his tenure as Deputy Secretary, and he openly questioned all of the presence and posture requirements as opposed to sort of core war fighting. We don't do exercises anymore. We don't do demonstrations of strength anymore like we did in the Cold War. A lot of the demand signal tends to be for steady state presence requirements, which is fine, but it comes at some risk of your ability to do core warfighting exercises. And so I think there's a conversation about security assistance. I think there's a conversation about what expeditionary diplomacy means. I would hope that the next secretary would focus the department more on warfighting excellence and trying to grapple with what that means. Because I think, frankly, over the last 10 to 15 years, even though we've been involved in these two very stressful wars overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan, I do think when I look at the future and I look at the rise of true near-peer competitors, I do worry that the department has sort of lost a little bit of its edge in its technology, a little bit of its creative edge in terms of operational concepts. And I think it's time for the department to focus more on its core mission, which is fighting and winning the nation's wars. And I think there's a lot of, I would call it overhead, and there's a lot of fat in the system that I think folks on the Hill are looking at, and I certainly know that folks in the think tank community are looking at. But it's going to be an interesting conversation over the next few years to figure out where the department goes from here, because I don't see the budget top line getting much bigger, if at all.
So let me just actually riff off of a couple of things that you two brought up, actually. The first is, I think, Tom, your point, which if I read it right, your overall
Depends on whether you make it sound smart or not.
Yeah, your thrust was on the idea of first principles, right? That we're basically stuck in a routine, By that I mean the way we look at policy formulation, and we're a bit stuck in a routine. So let me just finish the thought by saying, and Sean, you seem to say, which I wholeheartedly agree with, right, that at the highest level, there isn't really there isn't really a culture of setting a strategic azimuth, if you were, for any federal department probably, but the Department of Defense in particular. So, I mean, how could we actually sort of navigate this, rationalize this, and sort of get the highest levels of government a little better at setting an azimuth, and then in that way setting, actionable first principles for the department to operate from?
I don't think there's any sort of structural way to make this happen. I mean, this is essentially the job of both the president and the Congress, because in our system, the oversight and both the raising and the employment of U.S. military forces is a divided responsibility. So it has to sort of come from at least a debate within the political class. And when the political class is uncertain, confused, and doesn't have a set of yardsticks to answer these questions by, I think that it sort of explains in a macro way what's happened to us over the last 25 years. And then you find the bureaucracy doing its thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would not disagree that I think it would be very important to invest in certain capabilities to maintain, the technological and other operational advantages that a really fairly small U.S. military has over a world of potential adversaries. But you can't, that's not solely that is not the sole job of the U.S. military. These are cycles that the department goes through, and particularly a professional force loves to say, we're here to fight the nation's wars. Yes, you're here to fight the nation's wars, but you're basically here to do whatever the nation tells you to. Mm-hmm. And that can include, and we see that it has included, a much more varied and wide-ranging set of tasks, all of which are completely legitimate. But absent a conversation, again, among the political leaders and an open dialogue between people in uniform and an informed dialogue between people in uniform and civilians, it tends to be two communities sort of talking at one another or past one another.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I don't know. I mean, when I look at the operational environment, I get worried. Like I said about I worry about a situation. Bob Work talked a little bit about this in a speech. I think he gave at CNAS about 6 months ago, where he basically said something to the effect of, 15 years from now, if the first thing through a door breach isn't an unmanned system or a robot, I think he said frickin' robot, shame on us. And I think we're sort of at that point where certain people, and I would include sort of Bob Work and others in this, are perceiving accurately, I think, that we're at this point where the combination of more assertive adversaries and the proliferation of more disruptive technology combined with increasingly sort of contested geographic space, right? I'm thinking here places like the South China Sea, could potentially lead to sort of a step change increase in tension and a step change increase in escalation, and maybe even a step change increase in the ways of warfare, right? I'm a fan of Clausewitz, war is war, but the warfare changes, and I think we're sort of at that point now. But as Tom was saying, I mean, our system doesn't quite detect that yet, sort of as an institution, and so you're getting different pockets. General McMaster I think perceives this. Bob Work, Ash Carter, our adversaries, and so when I say, when I look at the environment, I don't think that the main stressor for us as a nation or as a department is going to be stable, steady state overseas presence, security assistance, counterterrorism, special operations. I mean, we're in a fight with ISIS, and we'll remain in a fight with ISIS for the foreseeable future. But I'm relatively confident in our ability as an institution to execute operations like that. We've been doing that for the last 15 years. I don't think what we haven't been doing, I think, enough of, is thinking about what that sort of near-peer fight looks like. And this is not just an argument for more and more and more, because I think my views are formed by, I think, an accurate perception of how the actual operational environment is changing. I worry about our submarine forces. I worry about our aircraft carriers. I worry about our air wings that can't actually get to the fight. I worry about adversaries using huge salvos of guided munitions that put everything at risk. We see this in Eastern Europe. We certainly see this in Asia. And I don't see the department sort of reacting rapidly to it. You're starting to see it with the offset strategy, and I think that's all about trying to get the joint force into this world more rapidly. You're seeing the air and maritime domains accelerate rapidly in this, but I worry about the ground forces, frankly. I worry about a company commander 10 years from now doing an advance to contact against an adversary that has guided 50 caliber munitions. We're experimenting with that right now. Guided 50 caliber bullets. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what that looks like if you're a dismounted infantry soldier, 10, 15 years from now? We've got to be at the very leading edge, number one, of that technology, and number two, of concepts of operation that can exploit that technology, and number three, ways that we can defend against adversaries employing that kind of technology. I mean, 1,000-year concepts about, advancing against an enemy, massing fires in a coordinated fashion on the ground. I mean, all of these things are in flux, I think, in a way that we haven't experienced for the last, 25, 30 years, ever since what we call the second offset strategy with Bill Perry, stealth and precision munitions and satellites and ISR. So there's a lot at play, and so I'm a little worried about it.
I mean, I find nothing to disagree with, but we find ourselves in a position where, absent more resources to defense, we have to give up something, important things, in order to free up funds to do this kind of. And so it's a devil's bargain. It strikes me very much like the conundrum the British Army found itself in the 1920s, after they had pioneered the development of the tank and the use of airplanes as a combat in combat. They then went through all kinds of interesting experiments about how you do combined arms operations and so on and so forth. But their army was too small, and they still had an imperial constabulary requirement. So all the good work never advanced beyond the science project phase. And so, the British found themselves, once they did go to the, yes, exactly so. So we have to be able to sort of, walk and chew gum at the same time. I'm not worried about the aircraft carriers so much because they're never in the South China Sea. I mean, you can track where the carriers are, like, online, and we just did a little rack and stack on this. And as far as I can tell, the only thing that gets a carrier in the South China Sea is whether Secretary Carter can come by and have his picture taken and make a speech from that, because it's really, such an infrequent occurrence. And so we see the Chinese have basically moved the front line to the far side of the South China Sea. So we certainly have the capacity, the resources to both preserve what stability remains after 75 years of American previous effort. But I quite agree with Sean that it's well past time to start imagining how we are going to preserve that stability and that peace over the next generation or two.
Last question, I'm going to turn it over to the audience. It just strikes me, based on some work I've been involved with over the last year, that I want to throw this out to you. Are we competing? See, so one of the things that's very interesting is one of the conclusions in this work we came to, it was a point you made, Sean, to tell you the truth, is there are very real challenges out there. There are folks who are engaged in campaign-like activity against the United States and U.S. interests. And the fundamental question is, are we operating in response? Are we operating against that? Or are we, as you pointed out, sort of exercising according to routine, right? Doing presence for presence sake and sort of filling the same template up of activities that we did the previous year based on that's the way we've always done it and that's demand. Or are we doing that, or are we actually purposefully operating against the challenge?
I don't know how to answer your question properly. Maybe just with a brief anecdote. I remember, I was one of the folks in the Pentagon in 2009 that really I think sort of drove the original what the pivot to Asia, what we now call the rebalance to Asia. At the time, it was a series of posture initiatives. We tried to pry open the door with the Philippines that we see. That has taken time, but we're getting there. Sort of relatively sizable rotational presence of Marines in Darwin, forward stationing littoral combat ships in Singapore. And there was a whole kind of series of sort of what we called baby steps. I don't think that phraseology survived the final brief, but that's the way I thought about it was, look, the way you actualize a pivot to the Pacific is that you make it, you do a couple of relatively small things every year for like a decade or two, and any one of them in and of themselves isn't sort of all that magical or disruptive or costly or politically fraught, but over the course of time, it will effectuate. Anyway, but that was the original intent. And in the process of kind of pushing different components of the Pentagon to sort of fall in on this thinking, we asked a bunch of questions, one of which I remember was, I think I asked the Navy, or maybe it was PACOM, map out your interactions in the Pacific, like all of your, just give it, because the response was, well, we can't do that because our demand signal is already too high, so we can't do anything extra, so go away. So we sort of peeled the layers of the onion, and basically they had a spreadsheet of all of the port visits that they had done the previous year, and they basically wanted to do the same number of visits the next year and the year out. There was no strategy there. It was basically like, well, those were the port visits we had been doing, and we're going to continue to do that. Therefore, that's a requirement. Therefore, we don't have the bandwidth to do anything else, so go away. And you see that kind of bureaucracy does its thing constantly in the department. It's not just the department, the White House and the State Department, et cetera. But so I tend to be skeptical when I hear, quickly dismissive comments like, "Well, we can't do that; it's too risky." Right? Tell us where to take risk on so we can do that. I mean, you've really, and I guess it's a challenge for the secretary all the way down, and senior leaders in the Joint Staff and the chairman. But I'm relatively unconvinced that a department that is funded to the tune of $500–600 billion a year, you add up the ground forces across the different domains, you're basically looking at 1 million people, under arms. The kinds of things we're doing with we can afford to do things, I think, without necessarily, I take Tom's point, if we truly, if we're as efficient as possible and we can't do the things we want to do, I'm totally willing to sort of entertain, well, then we're going to have to go to the Hill and ask for more money or be part of that conversation. But I'm not sure we're there, just based on the scar tissue that I carry from looking at these kinds of things over time. I think there's ways. Secretary Gates said it, I think before he left as secretary. $500 billion a year really ought to be enough, and that's sort of my threshold for thinking about these things. I tend to not fall in on the view that we need more money necessarily. I think there's different ways we can allocate risk across the department, hard choices we can make about end strength versus capability, quantity versus quality, overseas posture versus expeditionary posture, creative con-ops. These are all different variables in the force development, force posture equation that I think when you're a force planner or someone in the department, those are the things that you want to be looking at first before you say, well, we just need more money for something.
Right.
To try to, put myself in the, in the middle position, so to speak, I do think that there are, at a higher level, there are reorganizational things that we could do that would make our resources go farther. And a lot of this has to do with the unintended consequences of the Goldwater-Nichols law. I mean, jointness is great when everybody's in the same fight, but now we have too many things for the joint force to do. And so we have taken advantage of jointness in ways that have had, again, unintended consequences. It's really cool that we can provide fire support for a combat outpost in Nuristan from an F-18 off a carrier. Now, is that the most efficient way to do it? Probably not. It's the kind of thing it's good to be able to do in extremis, but it's not the way to do your day-to-day business. And you could, the fact that we don't have the bulk of our fleet in the Pacific, which last time I checked has a lot more blue on the map than, say, Europe does, is a choice. It's because we use these resources principally in the Middle East. But now we're also, the fact that we're going to try to increase our European posture is going to take a not insubstantial amount of resources that have been rotated to elsewhere. I mean, how many times has 173rd Airborne gone to Afghanistan in the past 10 years, which takes them away from their primary, or emerging deterrent mission. So if we could sort of, and I think the service chiefs who are obviously the suppliers for the theater commanders understand this, because again, they have to meet these requirements. And so rebalancing between the long-term institutional point of view and the day-to-day view is something that I definitely would support. I still think at the end of the day you'd find yourself, if you can, short of a six-pack, but reasonable people could argue about that.
Right. So look, I think we're going to open it up to questions from the audience as well as from those that are watching live streaming on the internet. And it looks like I got a couple of questions already from the internet, so I'm gonna go with that first. So let me since the conversation sort of focused a little, your conversation's sort of focused on the near peer competitor, right? How do the various economic trajectories with respect to the Chinese sort of impact their ability to compete, and how do we match up against that?
I mean, I'm not an economist, but I mean, China will be a great power. I think they, I think either way, whether there's a slowdown or whether there continues to be sort of a 6, 7, 8% growth year over year, I'm not sure China's behavior in places like the South China Sea or the its overall trajectory of its military modernization is going to be affected much by sort of a relative up or down. I mean, and I appreciate Tom's views on this too. When I see what China's doing, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
I think it's rooted in what they see as what they've told us is their sort of core national interests. I think it is a very reasonable strategic posture to sort of think about when you think about, say, their energy requirements, when you think about their urbanization, sort of their overall demography and their energy demand signals. It makes a lot of sense if you're China to be pretty worried about your sea lanes of communication going from the East China Sea through the Straits into the greater Indian Ocean. I see all of their basing and posture diplomacy along the rim of the Indian littoral and its negotiations with Russia. I think that's all sort of obviously rooted in core strategic concerns. So I see that as relatively consistent. Obviously, there could be some exogenous economic shock or corruption in the party sort of undermines leadership. But absent that, I'm not sure a couple percentage swing here or there, and their overall economic posture is going to change things much.
Yeah, I fundamentally would agree with that. And if anything, it seems, at least in the near term, as likely to be the case that if things get tough at home, they will relieve the political pressure by pursuing greatness abroad. That would not be unprecedented in human history. And they've been at it for quite a while now. I mean, they've taken their time, and in many ways, they're not as anxious or grabby about things, say, as Vladimir Putin is.
It's a little more overt.
But they have a sense that over the long haul, they will become a great power. And again, they're happy to grab stuff that's available and looks, at a low cost. But again, particularly investing in establishing ports in the Indian Ocean is just as clear an indication as you can possibly have that they have global ambitions, that they understand that in the modern world, and particularly in trying to revise the order created by us, which is a truly global system, they have to operate they can't just simply carve out a sphere of influence in their neighborhood that has no reference to the rest of the world, and particularly as they well know that their own economic growth is connected to the outside world. Lastly, they're doing something that they've never done before or haven't done in a long time. So the one thing that I worry about is that they'll make as many mistakes as we made on the path to becoming a global power, and they might even make some uniquely Chinese mistakes. But our ability to sort of predict and forecast their behaviors, to see the world as they see it, is something that I'm not sure we've got a good handle on.
Right. I think we're going to come back to that, but let me just first ask the audience if there's a question that anyone might have. Yes, sir. There's a microphone coming.
Gentlemen, Lebo with the Voice of America. In terms of near competitors, you guys talking, a lot about China, but when you listen to military leaders, when they go Capitol Hill, they always mention Russia, always the number one. I wonder why there's a difference, why they're saying that. And then secondly, in terms of the warfighting capability for the Pentagon, do you think they're about the same in terms of tackling either Russia or China, or it's going to be a different set of capability when we have to deal with either Russia or China?
Thank you very much.
That's a good question.
That is the million-dollar question right now, because I think the point that was pointed out is we had a whole series of serial testifying going on Capitol Hill with 4-star appointees, and each one of them seemed to be singing from the same playbook when it came to Russia. So I'd be very interested in that is the question. Thank you very much, sir.
Look, I think there's plenty of material for everybody. It's not like they're a real peer competitor in the way that they field a full service or full spectrum.
Are you talking about the Russians?
The Russians,
right.
yeah. But there are some things on the high-tech end that are really worrisome, that are fully competitive with anything we can field. Submarines is an area. Their missile defenses, air defenses are extraordinarily good. They retain a ton of artillery. The God of War still rules in Russia. They've developed this unconventional warfare capability to some degree. They're really good at cyber. They make, and they'll proliferate their frontline systems pretty much without discrimination to anybody. I mean, in pretty short order. Iran will have, a pretty good conventional force with, top quality aircraft in the same defenses. I mean, their pilots may be good at stuff like that, but so the Russians are operating on a lot of fronts, and things like that we have taken for granted, particularly air supremacy, and things like unimpeded access to regular old-style electronic warfare, which the Russians were always superb at back in the old days, and they've paid attention to, and we have not, because we have never been in an environment like that for 25 years. So all these things that have sort of fallen out of our toolkit are things that the Russians have pursued, and again, even through their difficult economic times, have made serious investments to create capabilities that are very threatening to us and also to our European allies, and we see the effect that just a couple dozen Russian airplanes had on the battlefield balance in Syria. Mm-hmm. So they get a lot for a little investment.
Sean.
Yeah, to your question, I don't see Russia as a greater threat, sustainable threat than say China presents. I mean, I see what Russia's doing and through the prism of, Putin, and he's using a lot of this, I think, as an escape valve to distract people from sort of core demographic, economic sort of erosion of Russian power. And so I see what's happening more of a manifestation of Russian weakness than of Russian strength. That's not to say that it's not worrisome. It's not to say that they don't pose military challenges. But when I look to sort of the far future, the 2030, 2040, 2050, I'm more concerned with the military competition with a country like China, that I see having a relatively sustainable economic growth pattern than Russia. So maybe in the short term, you could say Russia is more of a near-term sort of concern, but I do think over the long term, China's a concern. But to your point about the military question, which was a good one, and Tom said all the right things, I do think that, look, the core operational challenge, I think, for the Joint Force is thinking about military competition with adversaries that can, maybe not always, but for a certain period of time, approach something like guided munitions parity with the U.S.
Local advantage.
Yeah, I mean, whether that's in the Russian sort of near abroad, or certainly in places like Asia, how do you interact with an adversary that can? Look, we made a series of strategic bets. When we talk about the so-called second offset strategy, right? That we're going to invest in, we're going to try to establish a qualitative edge. What that meant is that we're going to assume that our adversaries are going to have a quantitative or numerical superiority on the battlefield, but we're going to counter that superiority with the quality, a lesser number of higher quality systems, F-117 stealth fighter, the early use of precision munitions, a whole ISR complex that allowed us to see the adversary first and shoot him first before they could see or shoot at us. And we've been sort of riding on that second offset strategy for 30 years. When we look to the operational environment, frankly, now and into the future, I don't think that applies any longer. We're going to have adversaries that have been looking at what we did, and the Chinese certainly did this after the Taiwan Strait crisis in '96, and they've been taking us to school, and they've been investing in the same kinds of things in their unique, different ways, and there's differences. But we're going to be interacting with adversaries that can compete with us on the qualitative dimension, and I think that changes a lot about how the Joint Force needs to think about operational concepts, how we need to think about mass on the battlefield. A lot of what the second or third offset strategy stuff is investing in is trying to increase the quantity of our precision munitions so that we can engage in things like salvo competitions with actors that have a lot of these systems. That changes a lot. Things like the Virginia payload module, we're trying to get the vertical launch tubes, trying to get them from, I think, 12 to 20 to 40 and 40 plus. The SM-6 innovations, making that an anti-ship capability. This arsenal plane concept that you might have heard about that the Strategic Capabilities Office is sort of thinking about reportedly in the Washington Post. There's a lot of stuff going on that I think when it all boils down to it, it's really all about investing in both the qualitative side, but also the quantitative side. And the thing that worries me as sort of a force development kind of nerd is the operational concepts, right? That's the sort of the spot where I think, the American way of war, using our all-volunteer force creatively, thinking about the sort of 06, 07s, those folks inside the services who are charged with thinking about how to use this stuff in creative ways to defeat adversaries, that is the key connective tissue between all of this. I sometimes get frustrated by the fact that when I talk about things like the third offset strategy or the erosion of our technological edge, that the response is, well, you're denigrating our people, right? The people are the most important thing, and you're talking about these technologies, but I grant folks the fact that I think a lot of the defense conversation tends to devolve into, we need to invest in this cool stuff. And there's been a lot of sort of fantasy about, military revolution, military affairs, and transformation, and a lot of sort of buzzwords. When you scratch the surface, there really wasn't much there. But to me, this is all about thinking about the ways of warfare and how the ways of warfare are changing, and the need for us to think very, very creatively about how the joint force maneuvers in a more contested operational space and prevails over our adversaries. And that's just as much a human problem as it is a technology problem.
So we actually have a number of questions, and so I'm going to try and sum them up and throw them out here. We had a number of questions on the quote-unquote gray zone, right? And what I want to do is I want to ask, I think it riffs directly off of something both of you said. So it appears, that we are, in large measure, the South China Sea is a great example. To what extent this is happening in Eastern Europe to a real strategic effect is a question, but the appearances are that we are being outmaneuvered, right? And there are a lot of defense-specific responses to that, competing with the capabilities of the Chinese, as you just described, for example. But to what extent are competitors of the United States employing, asymmetric approaches, hybrid approaches, gray zone approaches to us under the cover of some conventional capability, right? Under the umbrella of some conventional capability, and in response, we are responding symmetrically, right? We are responding to the cover and not necessarily to the method, right? The method that's actually allowing them to make the gains is not necessarily, they're just basically jacking up our risk calculation with the cover of their conventional or precision capabilities, right? So does that make sense?
Well, I think it's worth thinking about this in a geopolitical way, or with a bit of a political or strategic lens on. Look, from a Russian perspective, do little green men and cyber attacks that result in, NATO hugging the Baltic states or these states of Southern Europe being closer and redeploying, even on a rotational basis, American forward forces, walking the wire again. Is that a good strategic trade-off? I'm not entirely sure. The Russians these people are doing what they can doing, but to their, from their perspective, what we see as a symmetric response is also kind of an asymmetric response. We bring things to the table in terms of, sophistication, mass, political cohesion, so on and so forth, that are very difficult for them to compete with. I'm not trying to, I think we need to pay very close attention to what is actually happening. But as a proposition, it's not clear. This is certainly clever how effective it's going to be, particularly measured over 5 or 10 years. And I'd be interested really to know, for example, what the discussion in the Pentagon was about, setting up the European Reassurance Initiative. We're certainly well aware of all the gray zone things that the Russians were doing, but still they've chosen, and I don't think unwisely, to begin to, because the ultimate, our real weakness is one that every coalition has, and that's the political weakness. We had people who were in no man's land outside the wire, who were NATO members but outside the reach of NATO forces. If NATO forces now embrace, cover the frontline states, that, again, that's really a big setback for they. The best they could hope for was ambiguity and weakness on that front, and if the result is that ambiguity is eliminated, that's a big net loss for the Russians, I would say.
John.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being in the Pentagon and folks revisiting posture in Europe, and I think the decision was made in 09 or 10, I forget, to withdraw, quote unquote, withdraw 2 BCTs from Europe of the 4, and I think in recent years they had decided to take the other 2 and sort of make them rotational, et cetera. But I don't, and I remember at the time, it was a little bit of a paper exercise in some ways, because the BCTs that were sort of forward stationed in Europe were actually in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they had been there for more than 10 years. And so it was a little bit of a, yes, theoretically, but the question was, when we start to downsize the commitments to Iraq and Afghanistan, will these BCTs fall back in Europe, or will they sort of relocate back to CONUS? And there are all sorts of different arguments. Theoretically, it cost, there's some cost efficiency with centralizing in CONUS. The Army, institutionally, as I recall, sort of favored a little bit of that because they wanted to be more sort of expeditionary. And OSD Cape, I think at the time, had sort of a budget analysis that sort of said, well, it's going to be cheaper if we withdraw 2 BCTs from Europe, et cetera. But of course, what do we end up doing, right? We withdraw 2 BCTs, and then we say, well,
rotate them back.
Yeah, we're going to do these rotational. We're going to rotate forward. Okay, well, I don't know the numbers for a fact, but my instinct is that's just as expensive, if not more expensive.
It's more expensive.
It's more expensive, and so I do think there's an interesting debate to be had in the next couple of years, and Congress is a problem here too with BRAC. Part of the problem is the department is required to spend so much money on excess infrastructure that every dollar we spend on excess infrastructure here in CONUS is a dollar less that we can spend on overseas posture. Moreover, Congress is loath to approve sort of overseas military construction. So there's a political dimension here too. And I think a couple of the BCTs were in Texas, and the Texas delegation was all in favor, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a hugely complex problem. But one that I think the next secretary for sure, ought to really take on as a strategic priority, which is what is the disposition of our overseas defense posture, number one. What is the right balance between forward stationing and forward rotation, and what are the different risks associated with that? I personally think you can have a very significant overseas posture in ways that can sustain high levels of readiness. But that's a question you really ought to investigate, like we as a collective, because I think part of the problem, there are areas in the world, say the Marine Corps in the Pacific. Guam is a good example. Yes, you can forward station, say, ground forces overseas, but if you don't have the training grounds, there's a tax on sort of capability and a tax on training and a tax on readiness, and what is the right allocation of all of these things. But I think you can sustain a pretty robust overseas military posture and do so in creative ways that can, make sure that you have high levels of warfighting readiness for those forces stationed overseas. But I think that's an area where I don't think the department is sort of fully seized with, because like I said, you have the various constituencies. You have the combatant commanders, you have the services, you have OSD, you've got the sort of Congress. Thinking about a sort of a global posture review, a serious global posture review, could be a good thing.
I always feel like I've just been around long enough to
I know.
hemlines go up and hemlines go down. It used to be like in the late Cold War that the forward station forces were the most ready.
Yes.
With the exception of the 82nd Airborne or something like that. They had more gear, more people,
More training.
went to training grounds more than anybody did. And, they were there all the time because you could live in a caserne, and, Germany was not. South Korea used to be the hardship tour, and now it's a break from Afghanistan or, other places. But so we know how to do this, but particularly the Air Force and the Army bought into the rotational force generation model. I mean, the Sea Services had always done it, but that was really a fatal turn that we took. And it will cost us a lot to buy our way back out of that model. So now we find ourselves having to do it the way we know how to do it by rotating forces in Europe, and it's going to cost us. Between that brigade, the brigade that always goes to Kuwait, and heavier forces stationed in Korea, and on a rotational basis where you have the sort of 3-to-1, 4-to-1 arithmetic, that's the heavy army. That's their active duty heavy army. Mm-hmm. You've spent the whole pile of money that you have, basically, if you want to keep up that. They talk about heel-to-toe rotations. That's going to be as bad a deployment schedule as it was at the height of Iraq or Afghanistan for soldiers in those units. To get a permanent, and it's not like we're doing a war fight. We're just walking the wire.
Yeah. Just one more thing here. Just my first talking point was sort of, calling out this idea that we live in this complex, unpredictable world. But this posture debate is connected to that, because a lot of what happened was, we can't know for certain where the threats are going to emanate from, Mr. Brimley. Therefore, we need to have the most robust expeditionary sort of CONUS-based model we can, so that we can go wherever in the world we need to go. And I think that is a false, that is an incorrect strategic view. I'm of the view, we know, with sort of a 75-8, we know that we're going to face threats in the Asia-Pacific. We know we're going to face threats in the sort of Eurasian landmass, and we know we're going to face serious threats in the Middle East. Let's make sure that we focus our overseas defense posture on those areas, and let's make the investments on all the sort of infrastructure and facilities and access agreements we can, so that we are sort of ready to fight tonight for the forces that are deployed that way. But I think this sort of CONUS-based expeditionary force designed to, win in wars in a complex and uncertain global security environment, I mean, it's connected. So if you buy into the idea that we don't know where in the world the joint force is going to need to face contingencies, that leads you logically, ultimately, to this idea that, well, we can't place big bets. We need to focus on, the expeditionary part.
Which is, again, going back to my heart, is almost a willful misreading of what our traditional security interests are. I mean, we don't fight big wars in Africa or South America, okay? I mean, maybe in the future we will. But and that's where the centers of power that really determine the shape of international politics are. This goes back to the early geopoliticians of the 20th century.
Right.
That's what we've always cared about. The level of threat may go up and may go down, and they may introduce new capabilities and stuff like that. But we know where it's important to us to fight, and we can prepare for that. And all these things, if you can just remember what it is you want to accomplish, then it's a lot easier than pretending that I just don't know what's around the next corner.
Yeah, I mean, it's back to first principles, right? I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I think the interesting, it's a dilemma for the services, right? Because when you make the choice to be largely CONUS-based, at that point you have to find ways to be more expeditionary,
those are the guys
you know
who
what I
really
mean?
should
So
remember this. There's the guys with the long-term. It takes a long time to, build whatever, especially if you're trying to build a new one built around a new operational concept. So, if you're in a service job and somebody tells you, "Nope, we're never going to fight in the Middle East again," you should at least, like in the back of your mind, say, not so sure about that. Maybe we should hedge against that, or that Europe is forever net contributor to security or whatever.
But it gets back to sort of leadership because look, I mean, I don't want to be overly negative. Look, if you're somewhere, if you're in 06, 07, somewhere in a service or combatant command, and you're doing your job. You're basically saying, look, I need X, Y, and Z, or if expeditionary readiness is my charge and I've been tasked with it, well, I'm going to advocate for expeditionary readiness, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not as though these perspectives are, in and of themselves sort of flawed. Yeah, we want all those things, but it's a complex equation and you want balance among them. And I think back to my other point about sort of taking on that risk. It's up to the Secretary of Defense and the President, and the Chairman plays a big role here too, is to sort of say, these are the choices that we are making. These choices imply certain risk in these various components. And we are going to take that risk. We are comfortable taking that risk. I want a Secretary of Defense to go to Congress and say, these are the choices, like Secretary Gates did when he canceled a bunch of programs. We are making these decisions to be able to, in order to do X, Y, and Z, or to focus on the wars we're in. And that implies that we're taking risk as a department for X, Y, or Z. And I want to see that public conversation happen. Like, I want to see civilian leaders on Capitol Hill, but also on the executive branch, openly talk about this stuff. And that's my one criticism, is that you don't really see this. You see the service chiefs basically say, this is high risk, or I'm accepting too much risk here. But you don't see the equivalent conversation on the other side, which is, yeah, I'm asking you to take that risk because because we're going to make these investments here. That's an important part of the sort of defense policy strategy conversation that tends to get lost.
Well, it's interesting because any public statement of high risk at the highest levels of DoD, or as it relates to DoD, are always adjudicated before they get to public, right? You know what I mean?
Well, they try to pound the meeting out of it everywhere. We're taking super double probationary operational, strategic, and institutional risk.
Yeah.
And the guys on the committee say, "What the hell did he just say?"
Yeah, right, exactly. I'm gonna offer again to the audience, if we could. Do we have a microphone here? Right here, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, a member of Reagan Foundations. Sean, you mentioned about the rise of China. Where do we stand on the missile defense as of now? I'm talking about North Korea. So if you can comment on that as much as possible, appreciate it.
I can't go into. I don't know the details of our sort of pan-Asian sort of missile defense posture, but I will say that missile defense is a core area of concern when we think about the proliferation of munitions. This may seem disconnected, but I'll get to it. I was in Israel, I think, about 12 months ago, maybe a little bit longer, just at the tail end of the last sort of exchange from the West Bank with the missiles that were coming, the unguided missiles that were coming in. And I remember traveling around the bus, and I downloaded this app called Red Alert that everyone in Israel had downloaded. And basically it was disturbing, also fascinating. But as soon as a missile was launched from the Gaza Strip, Iron Dome, their system, would detect these missiles, and it would flash a message to everybody in the affected areas, and your phone would start to vibrate, and you'd have 30 seconds to get under cover. I can only imagine what it was like to sort of live through that in its entirety. But you start to realize that, those were all unguided missiles. And Iron Dome works because it can quickly discriminate which of those unguided missiles are actual threats to population centers versus which of those missiles will just sort of harmlessly fall in places that are not populated. And so it can quickly, within seconds, direct several interceptors to those missiles that are actually of concern. I worry about an environment where those unguided missiles become guided missiles. And that will change everything about how the Israelis need to think about missile defense. We're seeing the same things in the Asia Pacific, which is why I'm so obsessed with this idea of getting the joint force ready for a world of ubiquitous precision munitions. Because a lot of the missiles that heretofore have been unguided in the Asia Pacific are now guided. And so when you hear the military talk about surviving and engaging in a salvo competition, that's really what they're talking about.
Right.
How does the Joint Force operate in a world where every missile that the Chinese or potentially North Korea could throw at us could actually hit its target? And do we have the magazine capacity, the number of the number of interceptors, the number of rounds in each individual area to be able to address these missile defense, these missile threats? And so you're seeing a lot of innovation in the unclassified and classified worlds. Directed energy is a part of this. Railguns is a part of this. There's experimenting going on with using artillery, legacy artillery systems to be able to launch missile defense assets. So it's a huge area of concern and a huge area of innovation. And I'd expect all of our allies and partners, this will be a core part of our defense relationship with allies, but also new partners, thinking about what does a sort of a counter A2AD network look like in the Asia Pacific. And a key component of that counter A2AD network is negating the ability of adversaries to use their guided missiles against us. It's a huge area.
And just to jump, a lot of what Sean says also worries me a lot, but it also reintroduces the question of just simple numbers on our side. This whole, the term of art now is the salvo competition. We haven't had to worry about that.
Nope.
For probably the life of every soldier who's listening to this podcast. That's going to be different. And a lot of the efficiencies that we've taken over the last 20 years or so are predicated on precision, doing things for us that we used to count on volume to do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's back to the future again.
So I want to sort of roll a couple of questions that we have from our virtual audience into one. And these have been partially answered, but I want to sort of re-raise the question because I want to get some sharpness to the answers. So, have we lost the military initiative? And if we've lost it, what are sort of a handful of areas we need to address to regain it?
How would you differentiate the military initiative?
Well,
from
vis-a-vis,
the
let's talk about
strategic-
purposeful competitors first, right? So let's talk about the Chinese and the Russians. These are, look, whether we're going to pace against them, whether you believe we should pace against them or not, right? The bottom line is we are essentially, especially in the case of the Chinese, to a large extent pacing many of our higher tech capabilities against the threat that we perceive from the Chinese. So, the question is strategically, have we lost the initiative, and are we now, not have we lost the edge, right? Well, I don't know if that's true yet, but the initiative in the race.
I would say that we have not exploited the last 2 decades, say, vis-a-vis China, as much as we might have done for a whole host of reasons. So I think, at least on a strategic level, the initiative is actually with us. If we're talking about how the sort of contained China coalition, just to use a shorthand term, is developing with really only the mildest of encouragement and guidance from us, is quite heartening. And I think it's accelerating. So, the people who live in East Asia, almost all are now deeply concerned about what China's capabilities are and where they're going. They have a pretty clear idea about it. And I think that, over the long haul, is our greatest strategic advantage of the Chinese. The Chinese sort of want to eat things in little bite-sized, reef-size bites. But again, we're sort of almost by default presenting them with a large and long competition that can't, again, with the pretty grim from their standpoint. They do, and they certainly behave as though they're a contained power trying to break out and assert regional and dominance and global influence. They have a huge climb, and to me, it actually seems like the climb is, is getting steeper. The things that have happened in Japan under Prime Minister Abe are a really first-order example of that, and that has to be very worrisome to the Chinese. I don't, again, knowing what their exact calculation is something we should think a lot about, but trying to be objective about it, I think actually the strategic initiative is with us. I mean, we could have had, we could have reduced the risk if we'd worked harder and started earlier down this path. But I do think we've been very successful, or reasonably successful.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we've lost a sort of military edge. I think it's eroding. I've sort of written about that. But I think I'm relatively confident of our position. We spend a lot of money. We have favorable geography. We have a huge network of allies and partners. And I think if it's just, I think, maybe I'm being overly optimistic. It's a matter of making choices about the defense sort of portfolio. As Tom said, making maybe more overt moves, say in the Asia Pacific. I think a little bit more leadership would go a long way. I think we've all read about this in sort of the popular press about risk calculations regarding FONOPS and but I think I don't know what a Trump administration would do, but I think any well, I guess I can't say any moderate Republican president, but I mean, sorry, Tom, sorry. But look, I would hope that a next administration, Republican or Democrat, I don't think this is going to be a huge area of debate. Like we're going to be more assertive in the Asia Pacific. I think the next secretary, Republican or Democrat, is going to look at our overseas defense posture. I think they may not call it the third offset strategy, which is kind of a nerdy kind of term that may not survive, but I guarantee you the kinds of investments that are undergirding the third offset strategy, precision munitions, that's going to, Virginia payload module, undersea warfare dominant, that stuff's going to continue. It absolutely will.
Right.
So I think, to sort of end, I guess, I'm relatively confident with a little bit here or there, some dialing up and dialing down, some clear conversations about posture, clear conversations about risk. I think the department can do a lot to underwrite our sort of stable, relatively consistent overseas interests. But maybe that's just my young naivete showing through.
I think you could say something of the same thing about Europe. The problem is not that great, and we can, I think, deal with that. The place where that seems obviously not the case is the Middle East. If you were a man from Mars who visited, Mesopotamia in 2008, 2009, and you came back today, well, you would say, well, that's a lot worse, to put it mildly. And even more than anything else, you would be struck by how Iran is really poised to make a bid for a regional hegemony. And that would sort of like contravene one of the basic American strategic principles. And from where we are now to get to almost any improvement is going to be, again, having to do it for the third time and under different circumstances is going to be a very difficult one. I wouldn't want to even, it would take a long time to think through what a long-term strategy would be, or even, campaign operational strategies would be to accomplish steps along the way to get back to a favorable balance of power in the Middle East.
On that happy note.
Thanks, Tom.
This has been terrific. On behalf of the Commandant of the U.S. Army War College, as well as the American Enterprise Institute, we're very grateful for your attendance today. I would hope that you'd give them a warm round of applause for the great conversation we had, and we look forward to seeing you at the next 3 events across D.C. Thank you very much.
Thanks, bud.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, sir.
Pleasure.